Yes, so the Ramak at the end of Perek Beis discusses the idea of anava, the idea of humility, and he says there are three meditations or three behaviors or attitudes that one needs to develop in order to become humble, in order to be humble. The first is that you have to be margil yourself, habituate yourself, to be rodef achar hakavod, not to be rodef achar hakavod, not to run after kavod, or to be the other way around, to be a boreach, not just don't be a rodef after kavod, but the other way, to be a boreach min hakavod, that one tries to run away from kavod. They tell a story, Chazal actually say, in some ways, it's self-defeating, because it says anyone who runs away from kavod, the kavod runs after him, which actually says a person is zochet to kavod if they're boreach min hakavod. So in a sense, you're setting yourself up for failure. Somebody once asked a great Rav, he said, Rebbe, I run away from kavod, but the kavod doesn't come after me. How come? So the Rebbe says, because you're always turning your head to see where the kavod is. He says, if you don't turn your head, the kavod's going to come after you. So this is interesting, to be bareich min hakavod. Now, the Mesilas Yesharim actually has a very interesting observation about that. The Mesilas Yesharim says, however, that sometimes excessively avoiding kavod can turn into a form of arrogance in and of itself, a sense of gaiva. A person could be a bal gaiva as to how humble he is. So an example would be, let's imagine you're a Rosh Hashiva, you're a famous guy, right? And you're supposed to sit up front. But you make a point that you always sit in the back. And people go over to you and say, sit up front. No, I sit in the back. You see, what happens there is, you're making a conspicuous show of how humble you are. So everybody's going to notice that you're sitting in the back. This is the Ramchal. And the Ramchal says, that's really gaiva. If you simply move up front because that's what you're supposed to do, you don't make a fuss, you don't make a thing, that's humility, because, you're not attracting, you're not making a scene with what you're doing. So this is very subtle. Sometimes when a person protests kavod too much, it itself becomes a gaiva, it becomes an arrogance, it becomes a way of drawing attention to yourself. What do they say? Hasidim tell a story. It's probably not even a true story, but in the early years of Hasidus, when Hasidim were trying to make their case, and there were a lot of misnagdim opponents who thought Hasidus was no good, so they say that a Hasidic guy once came to a shul on Simchas Torah, and he paid for the honor of giving out hakafos, meaning, right, hakafos. So he paid to be able to decide who gets to carry the Sefer Torah. Actually, customarily, we actually don't do that. We pay for atah haresa psukim, but we don't really pay for hakafos. But there was a minhag in some places, even today, that you buy the honor to assign hakafos. So he paid to assign hakafos, and he said, this hakafa is only for the humble people of the shul, the anavim of the shul. So people were fighting. You're humble? You think you're humble? I'm humble, whatever it is. And again, he was trying to show that, the story was trying to show that if you're not a chassid, you're a hypocrite, whatever. The story was trying to make a point. But that's the idea, that there's such a thing as being a bal gaiva about your anava. So that's one point to keep in mind, and that is, if taking the kavod is a normal and accepted thing, then take it, because not taking it is actually an expression of gaiva. It attracts attention to you, and the like. There is another point to keep in mind, and that is, I'm going to digress a little bit. Many of you might remember, if you've learned Maseches Makos, a Gemara at the end of Makos that goes through how each generation tried to reduce the number of principles of the Torah, meaning Moshe Rabbeinu gave us 613 mitzvos, 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments. And how do we know this number of 613? Because it says, Torah tziva lanu Moshe. Moshe gave us Torah The gematria of Torah is 611. So frek the Gemara, so how do you get 613? Moshe gave us Torah, 611. The answer is, Moshe gave us 611, but 2 commandments we heard directly from God. So the 2 we heard from Hashem, 611 we heard from Moshe. Which 2 did we hear directly from God? The first 2 of the 10 commandments. One is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. And the second is, Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai, you shall have no other gods. We heard that from Hashem himself. Then we got scared and we asked Moshe to be the intermediary. So Moshe gave us 611 and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us 2. So again, though, just let me digress for a moment just to clarify the Gemara. So the 2 that we heard from Hashem is Anochi Hashem Elokecha and Lo yeh lecha Elohim acherim al panai. So the Gemara says, Beferish, they are 2 out of the 613. So the question is, Anochi Hashem Elokecha is not a mitzvah, it's a statement. I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt. What mitzvah is in that pasuk? So the Rambam actually says, the Rambam writes, the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha is the mitzvah of emunah. You are commanded to believe in God. That's what the Rambam says. There's a mitzvah saseh d'oraisa called emunah. Ramban asks a very logical kasha on the Rambam. How can God command you to believe in him? If you already believe in him, you don't need a commandment to believe in him. If you don't believe in him, how is a commandment from a non-existing God going to cause you to believe into him? If you don't believe there's anybody giving you the command. It's like I go to an atheist. An atheist says, I don't believe in God. I say, you must believe in God. He says, why? Because God says you have to believe in him. I mean, what type of argument is that? I mean, he doesn't believe in God. The Ramban says it's logically impossible to have a mitzvah called emunah. Once you have emunah, then you accept every other mitzvah. If I believe in God, then God tells me do this, don't do that. In other words, mitzvahs come as a result of emunah, but there can't be a mitzvah called emunah itself. This is what Ramban says. But number one, the Ramban is contradicted by the Gemara. The Gemara says Anochi is a mitzvah, and the Rambam says Anochi is the mitzvah of emunah. So how do we answer that, right? The Ramban's question is such a strong question that how do you understand the Rambam and the Gemara in Makos? That seems to be going with the Rambam. So the answer is this. The answer is you're right. If a person does not believe in God, he cannot be commanded to believe in God. But the mitzvah is directed to a believer. So what's the point of the mitzvah? He already believes. The answer is, you believe in God because your father taught it to you. You believe in God because of a tradition. You are now obligated to investigate the intellectual basis for the belief in God so that your emunah will be grounded not only in tradition, your emunah will be grounded in rational knowledge, which means, according to the Rambam, it's so interesting. It's the opposite of what you think faith is. The mitzvah of what we call faith in God actually means the mitzvah is to ground your faith in an intellectually solid foundation. So according to the Rambam, there actually is a mitzvah to determine the intellectual basis for belief in God. Now, what's fascinating in Jewish history is that what the Rambam considered to be the mitzvah of emunah, many others considered that to be a sinful endeavor, because many actually discouraged philosophically investigating the existence of God, and there's a pragmatic reason for doing so. Because once you're throwing open God's existence to philosophical speculation, what happens if you come out on the wrong side of things? I mean, you're telling a person who believes in Hashem, investigate this. Yeah, if we knew where he'd come out, that would be fine. But God forbid, a person can come out in a different way. So many have actually said the other way around. It is not proper to investigate the philosophical speculations. That's why if I were to ask somebody here, can you get me a Moreh Nevuchim off the shelf, please? And you'll go to the shelf of the Rambam's writings, right? You have a Rambam on the shelf? Do you have a Rambam on the shelf? There must be, yeah, there's a Rambam on the shelf. Well, where's the Moreh Nevuchim? He wrote that. Oh yeah, well we have it in some subterranean basement here, whatever it is. Why is that? Why isn't the Moreh Nevuchim on the shelf with the Mishnah Torah? The answer was that the minhagim, so to speak, of the yeshiva world was not to engage in philosophical speculation, which actually would have been keneged the Rambam's very definition of emunah. Now here, I want to say that here, just for, I have to say Or Sameach is a little atypical, simply because since our people, many Talmidim have not been raised in religious environments, have already been exposed to Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and the famous atheists of the world. So we have to address this. At least some rabbis, like Rabbi Gottlieb, have to address the philosophical foundations. But if you go to Mir or whatever it is, generally speaking, they don't talk about these things. So it's very fascinating. I don't want to get into this. It's not our topic at all. But it's very, very fascinating how in some circles the Rambam Shita was that emunah through philosophical, intellectual exploration was considered to be extremely important. This was the mitzvah of emunah. And in other circles, really connected to the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was actually against it. This came out with a book that was even earlier than the Rambam. There was the Sefer Chovas HaLevavos, Duties of the Heart. Duty of the Heart is one of the great, great, great ethical Musar Svarim. It's way before we saw Saladra. Chovas HaLevavos is from the 1000s, before the Rambam. In fact, it was written in Arabic, translated in Hebrew, and the Rambam is made that the Chovas HaLevavos was his father's favorite sefer. Right? A very, very beautiful, deep sefer. And most of it is about duties of the heart, loving Hashem, fearing Hashem, tshuva, subservience to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's all about, training your emotions to serve God. But the first chapter of Chovas HaLevavos, the very first chapter, is called Shar HaYichud, the Gate of Unity, which is a long chapter philosophically proving the existence of God, based on logic. So the Vilna Gaon is said to have remarked, all of the Chovas HaLevavos is holy, but start with chapter 2. Start with Shar Beis, skip Shar Aleph. This was a mahalach. And there's a very beautiful, if anyone ever wants to learn Chovas HaLevavos in Hebrew, there's a very, very beautiful modern Hebrew. See, the problem is that Chovas HaLevavos was written in Arabic, so unless like Rabbi Madeline or maybe Rabbi Greenblatt, I also think knows Arabic. They can read it in the original, but most of us are going to read it in the Hebrew. But the Hebrew of the Chovas HaLevavos is medieval Hebrew. And medieval Hebrew is actually, even if you know Hebrew, it's hard to understand, particularly in philosophical terminology. So as a result, the medieval Hebrew was retranslated into a more modern Hebrew with some commentary. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, it's called Lev Tov. It's a beautiful, easier, it's a hard sefer, but it's an easier way to understand Chovas HaLevavos, Lev Tov. It's 2 volumes. But Shar HaYichud, he reprints in the original translation, but he does not retranslate Shar HaYichud, and instead he prefaces it with a 50-page anthology of all the different Gedolim that say you're not supposed to learn it. Starting with the Vilna Gaon and then a whole bunch of other people as well. So you do see, it's a fascinating issue that in Judaism there was a tradition that very much emphasized the vital importance of philosophical understanding of Judaism. And side by side, you have another movement which actually emphasized that such speculations were destructive and undermining of the faith, and that goes both from the Vilna Gaon's tradition and Hasidus as well. I mean, Rav Nachman of Breslev, for example, goes on and on and on and on and on about the evils of philosophy and everything else. And this was very typical of Hasidus as well. And even the Balatanya, I want to point out, who was an extraordinarily philosophical thinker, he doesn't philosophize regarding first causes, meaning to say, God is God, Torah is Torah. We'll philosophize from that point onward. But in none of his writings is there any discussion of proving the existence of Hashem. That it was always considered to be a given that was not subject to debate. So even among the Hasidic philosophical thinkers, they did not treat Metzias Hashem as subject to debate. And yet, the Rambam learns that itself is the mitzvah of Emunah. That is the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. Yeah.
How does the Vilna Gaon then answer the Ramban's question? Does he go with the Ramban's listing of the mitzvahs?
Well, he goes with the Ramban's listing, and indeed that's why he paskins Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah d'oraisa, which is the Ramban Shita. But how do they answer the Gemara in Makos? That I'm not sure. Okay. Now, I brought this in just to explain the Gemara, but I want to go further with the Gemara. So after the Gemara says, Moshe gave us a Torah with 613 mitzvos, it then shows how the later generations kept on reducing the numbers. David got it down to 7. Now, and it quotes Psukim, 13, 7, etc. Now, obviously, when it says they went from 613 to 13 to 7 to whatever it is, that doesn't mean they were throwing out mitzvahs, but rather they understood that it's hard for a person to keep in his mind 613, so they tried to give principles by which if you keep these X number of principles in your head, you'll be able to reconstruct all of the commandments. So the numbers, the Gemara, it's a long Gemara. The Gemara in Makos keeps on showing how different Nevi'im were reducing the numbers. Now we get towards the end, we get to the prophet Micha. Micha reduced the principles to 3. You want to know the Torah? Keep these 3 principles. And this is actually a very famous pasuk. Of course, we know, Mikel Kamocha, the whole Talmud Devorah was based on that part of Micha. This is a different pasuk in Micha. Ma Hashem Elokecha shoel mimcha. What does Hashem ask from you? Ki im. 3 principles. Asos mishpat, to do justice. Avas chesed, to love kindness. Hatzneya lechas im Hashem Elokecha, and to walk with humility. So tznius does not mean skirt length. Tznius is a sense of humility and modesty. Humbly. To walk humbly with Hashem. Do justice, love kindness, walk with humility and modesty before Hashem. These are Micha's 3 principles. I believe this is on some government building in the U.S. I can't remember what it is. Isn't it on some... maybe the National Archives? I don't know why it's being National Archives, but somehow I remember. Gonna have to check. But this verse is actually on some government building. Yeah.
I mean, it seems that you could, if every generation tries to reduce, you could fold any of these 3 into each other. So you could say that real justice is being kind to other people and also being humble. Real humility is knowing what is best, so it's being just and others and kind. Why do we stop at this point?
See, that's true. That's true. But I think it's important to know that even when you reduce things, you need to preserve a certain redundancy of expression so that certain ideas are realized. If you try to be too short, you're going to miss a lot. In fact, it's been pointed out, I think in general communication, that you need a redundancy factor of as much as 50% in order to communicate your ideas clearly. Meaning there has to be a redundancy. It's an interesting thing to say about Rashi. A Maisha they say about Rashi. Rashi, of course, one of Rashi's great geniuses is the brevity of his expression combined with the clarity. It truly is very, very, very phenomenal. And just to show you how phenomenal it is, we actually have a control case. Because in Arvei Psachim, and we have the commentary of Rashi, and we have the commentary of his grandson, the Rashbam, who was one of the Gedolei Rishonim. And you can see right off the bat that the Rashbam's commentary is around twice the number of words of Rashi on the same passage. And usually, Rashi gets the message across just as good. Right? So that's an extraordinary achievement. The ability of clarity and brevity are normally kind of contradictory. Rashi was able to accomplish both of them. So they tell the story that somebody wanted to write a Kabbalistic commentary on the Gemara to show how the Gemara has all sorts of allusions to Kabbalah. And they had a committee of people, like 50 people, and they wrote a commentary on Shas explaining the secrets of Kabbalah in the Gemara, and the commentary was like 50 volumes or 100 volumes. And the Rebbe said, okay, you got everything down, now abbreviate it, shorten it. So they shortened it to like 25 volumes, and they kept on shortening it and shortening it and shortening it. And the final commentary they came up with is they came up with Rashi, meaning Rashi's commentary are all of those things that they had to put into their volumes and the like. So what are Micha's three things? Asos mishpat, to do justice, love kindness, and walk with humility in front of Hashem. Hatznei Alechas. Now, after Micha came Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Yeshayahu was a younger contemporary of Micha. In fact, there are quite a few psukim in Yeshayahu that are actually almost borrowed from Micha. Sometimes Nevi'im borrowed from each other. Sometimes a Navi will quote a pasuk from another Navi. And Yeshayahu says, Shimru mishpat, keep justice, v'yasu tzedakah, and do charity. And that's it. He got it from 3 to 2. Now, the two that he mentions are slightly different than Micha's, but they roughly correspond. Micha said, do justice. Yeshayahu said, protect justice, which means don't do injustice. Micha said, love kindness. Yeshayahu said, do charity, which is an expression of kindness. And I'll talk about why he changed it a little bit, but it's roughly parallel. But the interesting thing is, he leaves out entirely Hatznei Alechas. He leaves out walking humbly with Hashem. Why does he leave that out? Is that not important? It surely is important. Why would Yeshayahu leave it out? So there's something important here, which I think is another correct. Right? I've mentioned Boreach min Kavod, but then I said from the Ramchal that sometimes when you conspicuously are Boreach min Kavod, that itself can become gaiva, because you're making a scene. You're too conspicuously humble. You take the kavod you're offered, no one's even going to notice. You turn down the kavod, all of a sudden it becomes, what is tzaddik, etc. So the Ramchal warns us that there are psychological games a person plays, maybe with himself, that the humility itself may become a form of gaiva. That's one point. The other point is this idea that in Yeshayahu, Hatznei Alechas is omitted. Why would Hatznei Alechas be omitted? So the explanation is, each of the Nevi'im is reflecting a Yeridas HaDoros. As Doros are getting weaker, we need to formulate principles. And Yeshayahu is suggesting that there is a time in life in which you shouldn't be so modest about your mitzvahs, because you need other people to see you and learn from you. I knew a person who's no longer alive, and he was a shomer mitzvahs, but he never really learned Torah. He never really, whatever. He was not functioning, we would say. Although you never know, but seemingly he was not functioning on a very high level. But he told me once that his father was a great, great, great tzaddik who learned Torah all the time, but his father was so humble, he never wanted his family to see him learn Torah. So he would get up 2 in the morning and learn for 5 hours. If somebody else got up and went into the kitchen, he immediately covered the Gemara with the newspaper. So nobody would see. He says the only reason he knows his father learned is like by accident, he saw it once. But the father, in other words, was so humble, he didn't want his own family to see him learn because he didn't want them to think he was a great person. So think about that, On one hand, humility. Hatznei alechas. Boreach min hakavod. He was running away from even his family respecting him because of Torah learning. But was that good or was that bad? Maybe he should have made a point. When I learn, I will learn in front of my children. When I give tzedakah, I will write the check in front of my kids. So my kids will see that Torah is important. They will see that tzedakah is the right thing to do. In other words, sometimes you gotta be a little bit conspicuous about your avodas Hashem because you need to be an influence, certainly on your family, but even on other people, right? A person might say, I don't want people to know that I learn, at midnight, so I'll learn in a private place. Well, sometimes be in the base medrash or be in a place where people do see you. You may say that's gaiva. Well, maybe it can be gaiva, but it can also be a way that you want to be a positive influence on other people. And therefore the remez is, Yeshayahu omits hatznei alechas, to be merames, that in a weak door, ideally your avodas Hashem should be private. No one needs to know about what you're doing. But sometimes, l'tzoyrech hador, whether it's your family or your community, you need to be a little bit conspicuous about your avodas Hashem, so people will learn from it. They will be inspired, maybe to follow your example, or in one way or the other. Right? So that's an interesting point. They say, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, apparently in Lithuania, the first few decades of the 19th century, there were many, many Jews, not many, but a small group of Jews who lived a life that we would call hermits, meaning, say, these were tzaddikim, these were great, great tzaddikim. And they spent the whole week in the forest alone, separated from their families. They would only go home on Shabbos to be with their families, and then they spent the whole week in hispaidus, essentially in isolation, serving Hashem, learning, davening, having no connection with anybody, just by themselves, in isolation. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, as a young man, was very attracted to that way of life, where you focus on your avodas Hashem, your growth. Nobody knows what you're doing. Nobody sees what you're doing. You're a nister. You're a hidden person. But then he realized, as he saw a generation of more and more Jews leaving the Torah through Haskalah, reform, other things, that he needed to be open in teaching and open in getting a reputation, because these were the vehicles that he utilized to bring people to Hashem. And he said, listen, for me to be a hermit is better for me. But is it better for the Jewish people? Is it better for Am Yisrael? What gives me the reshus to concentrate on my aliyah when I have the capacity to help others? Right? And therefore, he became, famous, so to speak, even though he didn't want to be famous, but he did it l'shem shemayim. In fact, they tell the story in the early years when he was creating the Musar movement, just like Hasidus had opponents, Musar had opponents. People were not in favor of the Musar learning and the Vadim and everything else. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter had to establish his credentials as a big Talmid Chacham, meaning in Lithuania, you couldn't just be an inspirational guy. You had to be a Bucky and Shas and Poskim, and only then they'd listen to you. If you weren't knowledgeable in Kol Torah Kula, they just dismissed you. So he would travel around and he would give these very complicated pilpul shiurim. He would put up Mara Makomos, references to Shas and Rishonim, and he would give a brilliant shiur based on the Shas and Rishonim. And then, once he won them over, he would talk about Musar and Midos and all of those in Yonim. So there were some people who wanted to discredit him, so they switched the Mara Makomos. He put up, a list of Mara Makomos, and they put together Mara Makomos that had no connection with each other. It made no sense. In other words, the Mara Makomos were not connected, and they hand him these Mara Makomos. These are right before the shir. These are the ones that are posted. Now, I don't know why he couldn't have just said these are the wrong ones, but whatever, he felt he had to go with the list they gave him. So it mentions that he turned white for like 5 seconds. He closed his eyes for 10 seconds, and then he gave on the spot a brilliant shir based on these unrelated Mara Makomos. His Talmud, Rav Itzel Petterberger, whose real name was Rav Yitzchak Blazer, but he was the Rav of St. Petersburg for a while, so he was called Rav Itzel Petterberger, said, don't think Rabbi Yisrael Salanter needed 10 seconds. He could have done it instantaneously. So why did he take 10 seconds? Because he had to make a cheshbon hanefesh. I can do this immediately, but then they're going to think I'm a super genius. And that's gaiva. So the question is, should I allow myself to do something that's gaiva? Or should I say no? In other words, I'm balancing my need to be mezakeh the rabbim with gaiva. In other words, maybe I'm making my cause stronger when they see how, genius, iluyish I was, right? So it says that was the Musar Shiko that Rabbi Yisrael Salanter took a few seconds for. He says it wasn't making the shir. The shir he could have done immediately. It was the cheshbon of Anava. And this is an interesting shikul, right? The person says, I want to be private. I want to be private. I don't want to, get involved in reputation and everything else. Yeah, and that's Hatznei Alechas. But there's a remez that sometimes for Klal Yisrael you have to do it. And by the way, I was a Rav of a shul for many, many years. And, in America, maybe less so in Israel, the minhag is every shul and every yeshiva has an annual banquet, right? And an annual banquet, which tries to attract money, you always have a guest of honor, right? That's how you do it. We're honoring, Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. And the hope would be people will give money to them in honor of Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so. So Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so always say no initially. Right? I don't want to be honored. I don't want to be honored. I don't want my name. I don't want to be honored. So, I did this for 25 years. So for 25 years, what is the argument that every Rav has to make to the guest of honor? We're not doing it for you. We're doing it for the shul. We're doing it for Klal Yisrael. We're doing it for the yeshiva. You have to be willing. Right? So I know the pitch very well. You have to be willing to accept a kavod because it is for the greater good of the community. Now, yeah, I'll admit it was a sales pitch, but it's emes. But it happens to be a true sales pitch, because the idea was this is all nichlal in Yeshayahu omitting Hatznei Alechas, because sometimes you got to go against the Hatznei Alechas for the greater good. So the point I'm making is, on one hand, being boreach min hakavod is a gevaldige amida, for sure. On the other hand, there are two caveats to keep in mind. One is the Mesilas Yesharim's caveat, that don't allow your anava to become a source of gaiva. And two is the idea that sometimes for the greater tayelis, you need to accept the kavod if it involves being mezakeh the rabbim or whatever it is. It's a difficult cheshbon. Now, I still remember this. I'll give you another example. I came to Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, 9th grade, right? Long time ago. The Volozhiner Yeshiva was already closed, but it was, not far after the Volozhiner Yeshiva was closed. Anyway, so I came, and we had a 9th grade Rebbe, and the Rebbe walks into the room, and, nobody stood up. So the Rebbe was very, very uncomfortable. He said, I hate having to do this, but I have to tell you that when your Rebbe walks into the shir, he's not referring to me, you don't have to stand for them, but he said, when the Rebbe walks into the shir, you have to stand up because this is how you express Kavod HaTorah. Now he said, I'm very uncomfortable because intrinsically, I don't want you to honor me. I'm not asking for honor. It's not something I want. But you have to learn. You as young Talmidim, young boys, who are not, right, these are young kids. These are 14-year-olds. Young boys, you have to learn how to honor the Torah. So this is such an interesting example where, on one hand, the Rebbe wants to be a boreach min hakavod, but the Rebbe has to insist on a certain amount of respect because that's how kids learn that they have to show kavod haTorah. Right? So you see the balance here. And I remember his face to this day, how uncomfortable. In fact, I believe he's still alive. But kind of HaRav Sitner, he should live and be well. Ad Mea B'Yesrim. But in my ninth grade Rebbe in Ner Yisrael, that he said, you have to stand up when I walk into the room because that's kavod haTorah. You see, so the notion is that sometimes berech min hakavod has to be balanced with chinuch, with training people, with giving them the appropriate response. And but when these other factors don't apply, one's attitude should indeed be, I'm a berech min hakavod. Okay, we'll stop here.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.